The village named her a spinster at 33. A widowed farmer sent a chest of silk from Chicago. The chest came on the noon stage, which meant Hattie Corwin at the depot saw it first. That's how things work in a town the size of Pelham Crossing. News moves faster than horses, and a cedar-slatted freight crate with my name burned into the top and a Chicago return mark was news by any measure. It had been routed through Salida and Gunnison and was banged up some on the corners from the journey, but the brass fittings were intact, and when I got one end up onto the wagon bed, it shifted with the slow, padded movement of something that had been wrapped with care on the other end. By the time I drove down to the depot that afternoon, 2 women from the church auxiliary had discovered reasons to be near the weighing station, and Hattie herself was not pretending to do anything except stand with her hands folded and watch. I loaded it without comment, nodded to Hattie, drove out of the depot yard and up the hill to the farm with the chest in the wagon bed behind me and the whole of Pelham Crossing, or that portion of it assembled, left to its speculation. I put the chest inside the house and then went and finished my afternoon, fed the horses, checked the water in the low trough, went over the east fence line where 2 posts had been heaving and needed resetting before the next hard freeze. The November light went down early, and I worked until dark, and then came in and made supper and ate it and looked at the chest for a while. I did not open it that night. My name is Harlan Goss. I'm 51 years old, or will become February. I've been farming 230 acres of mixed pasture and alfalfa in the foothills east of Pelham Crossing for 23 years, which is longer than most of the people in town have known me, though they'd tell you they know me well enough. My wife Cora died 8 years back of a fever that came on fast and was finished in 6 days. We'd had 1 son who didn't live past his first winter. After Cora, I was alone, and I got used to it the way you get used to a missing tooth. You stop probing it eventually, work around it, and it becomes the new shape of things. The town had its picture of me. I don't fault them. A man who comes to the grain exchange and pays his tab and goes home gives people limited material, and they fill in what they can't see with what seems likely. What seemed likely about Harlan Goss was that he was a decent neighbor and a reliable hand if you needed one and had made his peace with solitude and didn't need anyone messing with it. Respectable. Closed. The quiet widower, well past any reasonable expectation of change. That was the picture. That was who I was in their accounting. The woman's name was Nettie Prudhomme. She was 43 years old and had been in Pelham Crossing for 13 years, arriving from somewhere in Missouri with a trunk and a letter of introduction to Old Harbison from a merchant who'd known her father. She'd started as Harbison's clerk the week she got off the stage, and by the time this story begins she'd been a full partner in the business for 7 years, since Harbison's eyes had gone and he'd needed someone to carry the accounts and manage the floor and had been sharp enough to see that the right person was already working for him. Harbison's was, to any clear-eyed assessment, Nettie's store. The sign on the door was a formality of sentiment. She'd never married. She'd had offers from what I knew secondhand, and declined them in the way she declined anything she didn't want plainly, without excessive apology, which some men found admirable and some found unsettling. The town had formed its understanding of her over the years, the way towns form understandings of women who are capable and solitary and not visibly troubled by either condition. Too particular, too businesslike. A woman who'd missed her season and settled into the role available, which was the capable spinster who kept the dry goods in order and the accounts straight, and the credit extended to those who'd earned it and not to those who hadn't. She was, in my experience of her over years of transactions, efficient and precise and occasionally funny in a dry way that caught you off guard, and she had dark eyes that missed very little, and a manner of listening that made you feel the full weight of whatever foolish thing you were considering before you'd finished the thought. Those qualities are not easy to summarize. What I mean is that she was a person of substance, and I'd known it in the background of my awareness for years without ever doing anything with the knowledge, because what was I going to do with it? I was the quiet widower and she was the capable spinster, and those were our pictures, and pictures don't ask to be reconsidered. They just sit there looking plausible. What changed was February of the winter, before the chest arrived. Hard February, ice on the water troughs every morning, the kind of cold that comes at you personally. I'd driven into town for lamp oil and supplies, and came through the door at Harbison's to find Nettie in a dispute with a man named Carlson who ran cattle south of town. Carlson was a substantial man in more than one sense large, and accustomed to that largeness working in his favor in most negotiations. He was at the counter with his voice raised, claiming she'd shortchanged him on a bolt of canvas from the prior week. She was at the counter with her voice at its normal register, telling him she hadn't, that she'd measured it with the store measure in front of him the prior Tuesday and the record was in the ledger, and he was welcome to examine it. He leaned in, put his hand flat on the counter and pushed his weight forward the way some men do when the words run out and they decide their size ought to finish the argument. It's a thing I've never liked, that move. Cowardice wearing forces clothing. Nettie looked at the hand, then she looked at him. She said, "Mr. Carlson, if you continue in this fashion, I'll ask you to leave, and the next time you come in for credit, I'll require payment before cutting, which is my right as a partner in this establishment, and which I'll exercise without any difficulty whatsoever." She said it without heat, not cold either, level, like she was discussing the price of axle grease. Carlson held there a moment, his weight on his hands, and then something in him rearranged itself and he straightened up and bought his lamp oil and left, which was the only sensible thing he'd done in the entire exchange. Nettie turned to me and said without pause, "What can I get for you, Mr. Goss?" I told her and she got it, and we concluded the transaction and I left. But on the ride home and that evening and for days afterward I kept returning to the moment. The way she'd held herself. The way she hadn't needed Carlson to back down in order to remain who she was. She was already entirely herself, and the question of whether he arranged himself around that fact was interesting but not, in the end, critical. I'd known men with that kind of self-possession. A very few. Men who knew the ground they stood on and could afford to be calm about challenges to it, because the ground was not going anywhere. I hadn't known many women with it, or I hadn't been paying the right kind of attention. After February, I started paying attention. The thing about honest attention is that it shows you what's actually there, and what was there with Nettie Prudhomme was considerable. The way she ran the store, the inventory decisions, the management of credit, the particular art of knowing which customer needed patience and which needed directness, and which needed to be listened to for 10 minutes before they'd hear a single word back. The way she talked to people, measuring out the right amount of warmth for each transaction, never performing friendliness she didn't mean but never cold either. The way she moved through Harbison's as though it were entirely hers, which it mostly was, with the settled authority of a person who has built something and knows every corner of it. I was 50 years old and a widower of 8 years, and I was watching a woman I'd known for most of that time as though I'd never actually looked at her before, which, in the way that mattered, I hadn't. The first time we talked beyond the counter was at the Anderson barn raising in April. The Andersons had lost their hay barn to lightning in late March, the whole thing gone in a night, and the town turned out on a Saturday for the rebuild, which was a full day's work with all hands. By noon the walls were framed and the food had come out on planks across sawhorses in the yard. Bread and cold chicken and beans and pie, people eating standing or sitting wherever a flat surface would hold them. I was on a fence rail with a plate when Nettie came around the far side of the barn with a crate of bread loaves balanced against her hip, and set it on the plank table, and looked at the arrangement of the food with the appraising eye of someone who understands logistics, and then quietly rearranged 3 things. Moved the bread within reach of the beans, shifted the cold chicken to a shaded spot because the day was warming, turned a serving bowl so its handle faced out rather than in. Small adjustments. Every one of them right. Then she stood back and looked at the table and seemed satisfied. She looked up and found me watching. She didn't look away. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you've confirmed something about them or arrived at one. Then she went back about her business. That was all. But something had shifted in the space between us, and I felt it, and I think she did too, though we were not people who made much of feelings before we knew what to do with them. We ended up sitting near each other after the food, not together exactly, 3 rails apart on the fence, watching the men lift the east wall into position. She said something about the Anderson boy, the youngest, who was hauling boards alongside the men and holding his own for 13. I said I'd been about that age the first time I did real work beside my father, and she asked what the work had been. I told her about the summer. We built a storage shed on the back of the family property in Kansas. Nothing remarkable as structures went, but I still carried it with me because of the particular quality of working alongside a man who is teaching you something real and knows you well enough to let you make the mistakes that teach themselves. She listened the way she listened to everything, full attention, no filling of the pauses, no waiting for her turn to talk. Then she told me about her father, that he'd been a merchant in Missouri, dry goods and some hardware, and that she'd sat beside him at the ledger from the time she could hold a pen properly. She said that when people asked why she'd gone into trade rather than teaching or some other respectable thing for a woman, she never knew quite how to explain that working in a store felt like continuing a conversation. She'd started with him that she wasn't ready to end. He'd died when she was 22, and she'd come west partly because the East held that loss too close around her. I said that was about the best reason I'd ever heard for doing anything, and I meant it without any performance of meaning it. She looked at me with an expression I came to recognize over the following months. The recalibration face she wore when her picture of something had just become more accurate than it had been. Then she asked about the farm and I told her, and she asked questions that showed she was actually listening to the answers, which is rarer than it sounds, and we talked for the better part of an hour. Not about anything that would look significant written down, but we were both actually present in it, which is what separates a conversation from an exchange of words. After the Anderson barn, I found more reasons to be in Harbison's than lamp oil strictly required. She didn't remark on this. She attended to whatever I was purchasing, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and she was never either more or less than she was, which I took as an invitation to be the same. By midsummer, I knew things about her that I was confident most of Pelham Crossing didn't know, because most of Pelham Crossing had settled on a picture of Nettie Prudhomme years ago and saw no reason to update it. The picture had its edges and their attention stayed inside those edges. I didn't have a picture of her anymore. I had Nettie, which was a different thing. In August, I went to Denver on a land matter, some acreage adjacent to mine that had gone into a contested estate and needed a lawyer and a judge before the deed could be settled. I was gone 12 days. For most of those 12 days, somewhere under the business and the city and the company of my father's old friend who'd relocated there and wanted to tell me at length about his comfortable circumstances, somewhere under all of that, I was thinking about Nettie Prudhomme. Not anxiously, not with urgency. Just, she was there in the background of my thinking, the way something becomes part of the furniture of your mind when you've given it enough honest attention. I came home on a Tuesday and went to Harbison's that afternoon, which told her something even if she didn't say so. She looked up and said, "Mr. Goss, how was Denver?" I said loud and expensive, and that I'd been glad to get back to my own ground. She said she imagined 12 days in a city would do that to a man. I said it would. Then I said I'd been thinking about something and wondered if I might say it plainly. She set down what she was holding and gave me her full attention, which she did not distribute carelessly, and said she supposed I might. I said I'd known her for several years in the way you know everyone in a small town, and I'd known her differently for the past months, and I found that I thought about her, and that thinking about her had not decreased over 12 days in Denver, but had, if anything, gotten clearer. I said I didn't know what to do with that except to say it, and let her tell me what she thought. She was quiet a moment. A man came in behind me and she attended to him without a word to me, quick, efficient, the full transaction, and when the door closed again she looked back and said, "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in this store in 13 years of working here, and that's either a fine compliment or a sorry comment on the customers." I said probably both. She almost smiled. The contained version, the one that meant something because it wasn't reflexive. She said we might have coffee sometime if I was of a mind. I said I was of a mind. The coffee was the following Saturday at the hotel dining room, which was the appropriate place for a thing like that in Pelham Crossing, and we talked for 2.5 hours. I drove home in the early dark feeling the way I hadn't felt in a long time, not giddy, not young, none of that, just inhabited, like the rooms in me had light in them again. We had coffee several more times in September and twice in October. We went to the harvest gathering at the Brannigan place and spent the evening talking to each other and separately to other people, and then finding each other again, which happened naturally, the way things happen when they're already the path of least resistance. I walked her back to Harbison's one evening when she'd worked late, the main street empty and the lampposts putting their yellow circles on the boards. We stopped at her door and she looked up at me and I thought, I am 50 years old and I have been a long time away from this particular feeling, and I know better than to be reckless with it. But I also know what it cost me to put the reaching away in that drawer 8 years ago, and what it costs a man every year to keep it there, and I am not doing that again. I told her I was going to Chicago in October. There was a land correspondence that needed resolving in person. I asked if I might bring her something back, if she'd tell me what she wanted. She looked at me for a moment. The yellow lamplight, her dark eyes doing their particular work of actually seeing rather than performing the act of it. She said silk, real silk, not what Harbison's carries. Something with actual weight to it. I've wanted it for years and never had a reason that justified the ordering. I nodded. She went inside. I stood on the porch a moment after the door closed and I thought about a woman who knew what she wanted and said it plainly and wasn't embarrassed by either the wanting or the saying. That is not a common quality either. Most people apologize for what they want before they've finished asking for it. She just said it. Silk, with weight, that was worth what it cost. Chicago was 9 days. The land matter took the first 2, and the rest arranged around business, and an evening with my father's old friend, who was now 70, and opinionated and valuable on both counts. On the 5th day, I went to a dry goods house on State Street that he'd recommended, the kind of establishment that had bolts stacked floor to ceiling and smelled of cedar and sizing and commerce conducted at a certain level. The woman behind the counter asked if I was buying for a wife. I said for a woman I had hopes about. She looked at me in the particular way that women in that kind of establishment look at men who have come in with genuine intent and limited knowledge, appraisingly, but without condescension. She was good at her work. She asked what kind of woman, what kind of life, what color she wore when she had a choice, whether she was the kind of person who saved things or used them. I said she used things. I said she was practical but not without desire, and that she'd asked specifically for weight, which I took to mean she wanted something real rather than something merely decorative. The shopwoman nodded like that was a useful distinction and pulled out another selection of bolts. We looked at 5 or 6. I picked 3. A deep green, the color of pine in shadow, with a density to it that moved like water when she shook it out against the light. An amber gold that the shopwoman said would suit dark eyes, and I confirmed the eyes were dark. And a dark plum, the color of something that had already made up its mind, something that didn't need to announce what it was. The shopwoman wrapped them in cedar batting and packed them into a small shipping chest she kept in the back for exactly this kind of order, and I paid for all of it including the chest, and felt not extravagant but correct. Like the scale of the thing was right for what I was trying to say. I wrote her a letter that evening on hotel stationery. I told her about the shopwoman and the questions she'd asked, because I thought Nettie would want to know that someone in Chicago had also found her worth thinking about carefully. I described the 3 colors and what I'd thought when I chose each one. I told her that she was a person the town of Pelham Crossing had been wrong about for a long time, and that I could say this with some honesty because I had been wrong about it myself, and that what I saw now when I looked at her was a woman who had built something real and maintained it over years with patience and intelligence, and had done so without requiring the town's approval of her methods or her life. I said I wasn't asking her to make anything of any of this before she was ready, but that I thought she ought to know how she appeared from where I stood, which was considerably differently from how the town framed her, and which seemed to me the more accurate picture. I sent the chest ahead by freight, so it would arrive before I did. When I got back to Pelham Crossing, I gave it 4 days. I wanted her to have whatever time she needed with the thing, and with the letter before I was standing in front of her with my face requiring an answer. On the 4th day, I went to Harbison's on a Tuesday morning, which was my regular day and therefore unremarkable. She was at the counter with the accounts open. She looked up when I came through the door, and her face did something I hadn't seen it do before. It went very still, not closed, not cold, but the kind of stillness that is actually the opposite of absence. Full presence, holding something. The face of a person feeling something substantial and not yet sure what to do with it. She said, "Mr. Goss." I said, "Miss Prudhomme, I'm back." "I know, a beat," Hattie mentioned. "The chest arrived last week." I said I was glad it had made it. She looked at the ledger in front of her and then at me. She said, "The plum is extraordinary. I put my hand on it and she stopped herself, looked at the counter for a moment. When she looked back up, there was a quality in her eyes that I recognized because I had felt it myself, a person arriving at the decision they'd been working toward. She said, "Nobody has done something like that for me. I want you to know I understand what it was." I said, "I know you do. That's why I sent it to you rather than someone else." She held my eyes. Then something in her settled, the last weight of the thing she'd been carrying since the chest arrived, put down. She said, "Come to supper Sunday. I can cook, and I'm better at it than the accounts would suggest, and whatever Pelham Crossing makes of it can be Pelham Crossing's concern and not mine." I said Sunday suited me. She nodded and went back to the ledger. I walked out of Harbison's and down the main street in the November air and thought, there it is. There is who that woman is. 50 years old, and there it is, and I am not going to waste it by being slow about it. The Sunday suppers became what they became over the following months, slowly, because we were not fast people, but steadily, the way things accumulate when both people are genuinely showing up. She came to the farm that December, and I showed her the land the way a man shows a woman his land when he means something by it. Not a tour with explanations for a guest. Just, this is what I've built and how it works and what it asks of me and what it gives back. She walked the east fence line with me in December mud and asked about the drainage problem on the low pasture, and I explained it, and she listened like it was going to be her concern too, which I think she already understood it was. There was a Wednesday that January when a cold snap locked the roads, and I couldn't get back to the farm before dark. She put the kettle on and got blankets from the cedar chest, and we sat by her stove and talked until well past midnight. And then we sat in our respective chairs, and she read and I read. And eventually the fire needed feeding, and we talked some more, and I slept in the chair and woke when the light was just starting, and she was already making coffee in the kitchen. Moving around in the particular way she moved in any space she'd made her own. That morning, the light coming in cold and flat through her kitchen window, the coffee in my hands, the sound of her going about her business in the next room, I thought, this is what I forgot was possible. Not youth, not some recovered version of before. This, Two people who fit in the same space without needing to arrange it. We were married in the spring. Small service, 4 witnesses, nothing that made a production of itself, which suited us both exactly. We went back to the farm that afternoon and she brought her things, and we rearranged the furniture with some disagreement and eventual compromise. I didn't want a woman with no opinion about where the furniture went, and by summer the farm had her in it the way something that has always been there has itself in a place. The sound of her in the kitchen. Her voice when she had a view on something I was planning, which was regularly. Her step on the boards in the early dark before full light. The cedar chest in the bedroom with the silk in it, faint sweetness in the room, the smell of something chosen carefully from a long distance. She's made pieces from the plum and from the green. The amber gold is waiting for something she has in mind that she hasn't fully explained, and that's her business. I gave them to her, and they're hers. What I had not fully understood before Nettie was what it meant to be seen by someone worth being seen by. Not categorized, not filed in the convenient drawer, not granted the space the town's picture of you allows and no more. Seen. The way she'd looked at me from 3 rails down at the Anderson barn, the recalibration moving through her expression, arriving at a picture that was more accurate than the one she'd had before. She had looked at Harlan Goss, the quiet widower, the man who'd made his accommodation with aloneness, the one you didn't expect anything particular from, and found something there she thought was worth reorganizing her life around. I had spent 8 years not quite believing I was worth much beyond the work. The farm ran and the stock were kept, and I was there when the seasons needed me to be there, and that was sufficient in its practical sense. But in the larger accounting, the one a man keeps in the quiet hours when the work is done and the house is still, I'd written myself as a man whose best was behind him, whose season for certain kinds of living had passed, and you accommodate yourself to that understanding. You close the drawer. You find the life available, and you inhabit it with what dignity you can manage, and you don't let yourself want what you've already decided isn't coming. What Nettie gave me, by choosing me with full knowledge of what she was choosing, a 50-year-old widower with a quiet manner and 23 years of work sunk into 230 acres, was the return of my own accounting of myself. Not a restoration to something prior, not a second-chance version of something that was gone. Something new, a woman of genuine substance, a woman who was nobody's fool and had proven it daily for 13 years in front of everyone who cared to watch, looked at what Harlan Goss actually was, and found it sufficient, and said so in the language of Sunday suppers and December mud on the fence line, and silk from Chicago in her hand in my arm on a cold morning walking out of church. That is not a small thing. That is, I've found, about the largest thing there is. Last Sunday, the light came through the east windows and caught the plum silk of her dress, and she was standing in the pew with the hymnal, reading the words and meaning them in that undemonstrative way she meant everything. And I looked over and I thought, this woman is extraordinary, and she is here, and she chose this with open eyes, and I will not spend one more morning of whatever I have left failing to understand what that means. After the service, she took my arm the way she'd taken to doing, her hand through the crook of my elbow, her shoulder close to mine in the cold morning air, and we walked back to the wagon without talking. She knew I was somewhere in my own thoughts, and she matched my pace and held on, and let the quiet do what quiet does when you're with the right person, which is fill up warm instead of hollow. The chest sits on the cedar table under the bedroom window. The silk is there, what she hasn't used yet, the amber gold waiting for whatever she has in mind. The farm is the same 230 acres it always was, same fences, same creek in the low meadow, same ridge going up into the sky in the morning. But the quality of it has changed. The way a room changes when there's a lamp burning in it that wasn't there before. I didn't know how much I'd gotten used to the dark until she brought the light back in. That's the only way I know to say it. That's the whole of what happened, and why it mattered, and what a widowed farmer in Pelham Crossing did when a woman he'd been looking at wrong for years turned out to be extraordinary. He went to Chicago and sent back the evidence that he saw her clearly. And she looked at that evidence and looked at him and decided he saw right. The rest is the farm and the seasons and the particular quality of a life that has the right person in it, which is everything, which is, in the end, the only accounting that matters. The summer after the Anderson barn, I spent a good deal of time thinking about the difference between knowing about a person and knowing a person, and about how long you can do the first while believing you're doing the second. I'd bought supplies at Harbison's for years. I'd watched Nettie work for all those years without seeing most of what I was watching. There's a particular kind of looking that records surface and calls it knowledge. You see a person do their work. You see them manage their transactions. You see them navigate the town's social weather and you think, I know this person. But you know the pattern of their movements, not the person making the movements. You know the outline, not the interior. What changed for me after February, after the thing with Carlson and the way she'd handled it, was that I started looking past the pattern to what was underneath it. And what was underneath, it was considerably more than the town's accounting of Nettie Prudhomme allowed for. The thing that struck me first was how she handled failure. Every business has its bad seasons and its mistaken decisions, and Harbison's was no different. In June, there was a shipment of seed that came in wrong, a variety that had been ordered for high-altitude planting, but that arrived as a lowland cultivar, and she'd placed a substantial order for 3 of the farms north of town, including mine, on the assumption that the distributor would deliver what they'd agreed to deliver. They hadn't. She called it wrong because the distributor had been reliable for 6 years, and she'd trusted the relationship too far. She came to me before I'd even heard about it. Came to the farm on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual enough that I came out of the barn when I saw her wagon. She told me straight out what had happened, her error in judgment, specifically, and what she was doing to correct it. She'd already tracked down the right seed through a supplier in Denver at additional cost to her, not to me, and it would arrive in time for planting if I could hold off 2 weeks on the north field. She didn't ask me to be understanding about it. She just told me the situation and the remedy and let me decide what I thought. I said 2 weeks on the north field was fine, and thanked her for coming out rather than sending word. She nodded like that was the obvious minimum and drove back to town. I stood in the yard after her wagon had gone down the lane, and I thought about a person who comes to the person they've inconvenienced rather than waiting to be found, who describes their own mistake without softening it, who fixes the thing at their own expense and doesn't make a moment of it. I'd known very few people in 50 years who handled error that way. Mostly people folded it up small and hid it, or blamed the circumstances, or let the other person discover it, and then performed their regret. Nettie just drove out and said she'd been wrong and here was what she was doing about it. That quality, the quality of knowing when you've been wrong and saying so simply and fixing the thing, is one I've always thought more about than most people seem to think was worth thinking about. My father had it. My wife Cora had it. It's rarer than it should be, and when you find it in a person you pay attention. I started looking for other things like it. Not cataloging her exactly, not the way a man catalogs a transaction. More the way you look at a piece of land you're considering, honestly, for what's actually there rather than what you want to be there. What was there was this. She was a woman of precise intelligence who rarely showed the full extent of it in company, because she'd learned that showing the full extent of it in company in Pelham Crossing made certain men uncomfortable, and she had a business to run, and uncomfortable men were bad for business. But if you watched carefully, you could see it at work underneath the managed surface. The way she'd price something before you'd asked, holding the number in her head while she turned it over once to make sure she had the inventory cost and the margin right and any relevant credit history. The way she'd look at a problem from 3 angles before she spoke to it, which meant she spoke to it correctly the first time and rarely had to revise. The way she listened to what wasn't being said as much as what was, The customer who came in to buy rope at the end of a bad season. The one who needed 30 minutes of being listened to about the weather before they'd take a recommendation on the bolt of canvas they'd actually come for. She ran a store, but she was running something more complex than that, and she ran it well, and the people who came in and out of Harbison's felt the care in it, even if they couldn't have told you precisely what they were feeling. By July, I was not trying to have reasons to be in Harbison's. I was going because I wanted to talk to her, and the store was where she was. She knew this. She'd have been a fool not to know it, and she was not a fool. She managed it with characteristic precision, present when I came in, attending to her business, talking when there was something worth talking about and not when there wasn't, never giving me more encouragement than she'd committed to giving, never giving me less than she genuinely felt. I understood this instinctively, because I recognized it as my own approach. Neither of us was going to perform a feeling we hadn't settled on yet. What I settled on was in Denver. My father's old friend, the one who'd gone there from Kansas 30 years ago and built himself a comfortable life in the import business, took me to dinner my second evening there at a restaurant on Larimer Street with tablecloths and wine and the kind of food that exists in cities and not elsewhere. He was 70 and shrewd and had known me since I was a boy, and about halfway through the meal he looked at me across the table and said, "You're thinking about a woman." I said I might be. He said he hoped I was. He said I'd been putting myself away for too long, and that a man who'd been as alive as he remembered me being before I'd got so careful about it owed it to himself to be alive again. He said it directly, the way old men say things when they've decided they're past the point of being polite about important things, and I listened and didn't argue because he wasn't wrong. He said, "Whatever you're being careful about, stop. Whatever argument you're using to talk yourself out of it, it's the wrong argument. A man your age knows the difference between caution and cowardice." I told him I'd think about it. He said he hoped I'd do more than think. I thought about it for the next 10 days, which was most of the rest of the trip. I thought about what I was being careful about, and why, and whether the why stood up under examination. What I was being careful about, when I was honest with myself, was being wrong about how she felt. Being in the position of a man who'd read a situation that wasn't there, which is a particular kind of humiliation that has a long half-life. Better to stay careful and not know than to be wrong and know it for certain. But that was cowardice, and I knew it. My father's friend was right. The man I used to be, the man before 8 years of careful accommodation with solitude, that man would have said something already. That man knew when something was worth the risk of being wrong about. I went to State Street and bought the silk. I wrote the letter. And then I came home. Those 4 days I gave her before going to Harbison's were not easy days. I worked the farm, and did what the farm needed and told myself I was giving her time, which I was, but I was also sitting with the possibility that she would receive the chest and the letter and find them presumptuous, and that the conversation on Tuesday morning would be short and clear, and the kind that closes something rather than opens it. That was possible. She was a woman who knew her own mind and was not afraid to say so. But that Tuesday morning, the way she went still, the quality of that stillness, I knew before she spoke. Some things you know. A man who's been paying attention knows what that kind of stillness means. "Come to supper Sunday." I'd heard better sentences in my life, not many. The Sunday suppers, as I said, became what they became. But there's a particular Saturday I want to tell about, because it was the Saturday I understood something I hadn't understood before. It was in January, a cold, clear one, and I'd asked her if she wanted to walk the North Meadow with me. There was a question about the fence there, 2 sections that had heaved in the freeze and would need resetting in the spring, and I wanted to see how bad it was. I asked her more or less without thinking, the way you ask someone who's become part of your ordinary life, and she put on her coat and her boots, and we drove out to the North Meadow and walked it. She walked the line with me the same way she did everything, present, practical, actually looking at what was in front of her. She asked about the freeze heave, whether it was a drainage problem or just the depth of the frost, and I explained the soil composition there and how it behaved in hard winters, and she listened and asked a follow-up question that showed she'd understood the first answer, which is the mark of someone actually learning something rather than performing the act of listening. We walked the whole section, and I noted the posts that needed attention, and she remembered them all without writing anything down. On the way back across the meadow, the snow crunching under us and the cold bright and clean, she said, "I'd like to know this land." Just that, not I'd like to see more of it, not it's beautiful. I'd like to know it. The distinction mattered to her, and she said it with the words she meant. I looked at her walking beside me in the thin winter light, her breath going white, her dark eyes on the fence line ahead. I thought, she is going to be here. She has already decided. She is walking this meadow the way a person walks ground they intend to be responsible for, and she has said so in the plainest way she knows how, which is very plain. I said, "You'll have time for that." She nodded once, like a thing confirmed, and we walked back to the wagon. That was the Saturday. We drove back to her house and she made coffee and we sat in her kitchen and talked, and the afternoon went down and the lamplight came up and we were still there, and I thought, a man could live his whole life in this kind of company. Not excitement, not novelty. This. The particular quality of a space that has the right person in it. We were married in April, small and unceremonious and exactly right. The first months on the farm together I watched her learn it the way she'd said she wanted to, systematically, the way she did everything, asking the questions that came from genuine attention. The drainage pattern on the east pasture, the habits of the two horses, which one wanted to be spoken to before you approached and which one didn't care. The best time to check the low trough in the winter. Where the lamp oil was kept and where the spare was kept, and why they were kept in different places, which was something I'd done for a reason I could no longer remember, and she pointed this out, and we moved them both to the same place, which was better. She brought her own knowledge too, and it was considerable. She knew prices and supply chains and the credit histories of every significant farm and business within 20 miles, which was more useful information than it sounds. It meant she knew which neighbors could be relied on for a quick loan of equipment, and which ones would need to be asked twice, and which ones you simply didn't ask. She understood the economics of the land in a way I didn't, because I'd been living inside them for 23 years and stopped seeing them clearly, the way you stop seeing the walls of your own house. She saw them fresh, and she saw them correctly. We had our disagreements. She had opinions about the alfalfa rotation that differed from mine, based on what she'd read in an agricultural journal that came into Harbison's with a book order. And she was right and I was wrong. And she said so, and I accepted it, because accepting it was correct, and because she didn't make me feel small for having been wrong, which is the only kind of being right worth anything. There was an evening in the first autumn when I came in from a long day on the fence line, and I was tired in the bone-deep way, and she looked at me and didn't say anything and put food in front of me and sat down across from me and just was there. Not filling the silence with something useful to do, not asking me about my day, not performing the presence. Just present, the way Cora had known how to be. The way a person who understands another person knows when to simply be in the same room. I ate and she was there, and after a while I felt better and said so, and she said she could tell, and we talked a little about nothing in particular, and then I slept, and the next morning was better. That too, that, maybe more than anything. The person who knows when the room needs to be quiet and stays in it anyway. I'm not a man who has an easy time with gratitude. I find it hard to say out loud what I owe and what it cost and what it means, because the saying of it always seems to be smaller than the thing itself, and I'd rather say nothing than say something insufficient. But I have thought, in the years since Nettie came to the farm and walked the North Meadow and learned the land and built her life into mine the way water finds its way into ground, I have thought about what I owe this, the silk, and the letter, and the 4 days I gave her, and the Tuesday morning at the counter, and the come to supper Sunday. What I owe it is every morning I've woken up in a house with the right person in it, every evening by the stove in the winter, every disagreement resolved and every silence shared, and every Sunday the light through the church windows catching the plum silk and her standing in the pew reading the hymn and meaning it. All of that. The whole changed quality of the remaining years. That's what a widowed farmer got when he sent a chest of silk from Chicago to the woman the village had decided about and got wrong. He got his own life back. He got to be known. That's everything. That's the whole accounting. I don't have a better way to say it than that. There is something I have not said yet, which is about the town. I said the town had its picture of me, and I said it had its picture of Nettie, and I said both pictures were wrong. What I didn't say is what it cost both of us to live inside those pictures for the years we did, before the pictures got revised. A man can tell himself the town's assessment of him doesn't matter. And on the practical level it doesn't, not much. The farm doesn't care whether Pelham Crossing thinks you're interesting or finished. The water trough needs filling the same way either morning. But a man lives in a town, and the town's assessment of him becomes one of the facts of his life, the way weather is a fact and the price of grain is a fact. And you can tell yourself facts don't affect you, but they affect you. You breathe them in over years and they become part of the air. What the town thought of me was respectable, reliable, finished. A man who'd had his season and hadn't complained when it ended and wasn't looking for anything different. And the thing about a respectable assessment is that it gives you no incentive to argue with it, because arguing with a respectable assessment makes you look ungrateful or deluded. And so you accept it and you become more of what they think you are every year, because that is the path of least resistance, and you are tired and the drawer is closed and there is work to be done. I had done that for 8 years. I had become the quiet widower, reliably, increasingly. The thing Nettie had done by choosing me was refuse to accept the town's assessment on my behalf. She had her own information, gathered through years of watching, and her information said something different, and she valued her information above the town's, which was the correct hierarchy. She chose what she'd actually seen over what was conventionally believed, and she'd done it without any fanfare, the way she did everything, just, this is my assessment, and this is what I'm doing about it. What that did to me, internally, and I am aware this is not a thing men in this country typically say out loud, was remind me that I had a self that was separable from the town's picture of that self. That Harlan Goss, the actual man, was not the same thing as Harlan Goss, the quiet widower, and that someone with clear eyes could see the difference. I had forgotten that was possible. Not that I'd decided it wasn't, just that I'd stopped expecting it and then stopped thinking about it and then stopped knowing I'd forgotten. She handed me back the knowledge that I was more than what the town had decided I was. I would like to be clear about something. This is not a story about a woman rescuing a man. Nettie did not rescue me. I am not a man who needed rescuing. I was farming my land and living my life and managing my grief with reasonable competence and would have continued to do so. What Nettie did was different from rescue. What she did was see me accurately and choose what she saw, and by doing so give me back access to parts of myself I'd put in the drawer 8 years ago because there didn't seem to be any use for them. That's not rescue. That's closer to what happens when someone opens a window in a room that's been shut up. The room was always there. The air was always ready. She opened the window. And what came back into me was the man who'd built things and wanted things and had opinions about things and felt things with the full force of his nature and wasn't ashamed of any of it. The man my father had seen when he'd worked beside him that summer in Kansas. The man Cora had known. The man who'd been in that drawer for 8 years, waiting with more patience than he'd had any particular reason to expect was justified. Nettie sees him. She sees him every day. She argues with him about the alfalfa rotation and walks the fence line beside him in December mud and sits across from him at supper in the lamplight and takes his arm on Sunday mornings, and lets the silence be comfortable when it needs to be. She sees the whole man, and she chose the whole man. And every morning I wake up in a house with her in it. I know that, and I don't waste it. The chest is on the cedar table. The amber gold silk is still waiting. The farm is going into another winter, the third one since we married, and the horses know her voice now, and the fence line is solid, and the alfalfa is in, and there is food enough in the cellar and wood enough in the yard, and the house, when I come in from the cold, has the particular quality of a place where someone is. The lamp is on. It has been on now for 3 years. I didn't know how much I missed it until she lit it. That's the story. That's all there is to it, and that's everything.